In this video, we're going to look at the Inflation Manager and how to render static HTML collection data. So what does that mean? So we have a UL, we can have an LI in here, and we can have a span that has a first name and last name. So let's just say John Doe, and John Doe has an age of, let's say, 20, right? And I can have multiples of these. So let's make this Jane Doe and the age is 22, etc., etc. But this is all very static. I can't bake this into my HTML because I want to render this list from a collection of data, and I want to do it with as little as possible churn and overhead to do this. So another criteria on this is that it has to be static of nature. In other words, we want to generate this HTML, get it into the DOM, and that's it. We don't expect any additional changes to happen to this, hence a static collection. And so when you want to do a static collection of HTML, you use the Binding Engine's Inflation Manager to say, here is a template, here is the data, go and generate for me this content. Let's go and look at some of the infrastructure that we have in place thus far. To start this process, I need two things. Like I said, you need to have a template that defines the HTML structure. You need to have data that represents the information. So here I'm importing a data object from this local JavaScript file, and you can see it's an array of objects. Each object has the same properties on it, so first name, last name, and age, with some separate values. And we want to turn that into that static HTML that we had a look at before. So we need to do something here in this space to turn that data into HTML. How do we do that? Here's the code that we're going to need to do the inflation. Let's just have a look at the steps first. Step number 1, register the template on the Binding Engine. Step number 2, generate the elements that you want to add to the UI. Note that the result is a document fragment. Then add that document fragment to the UI, and once you are done and no longer require the Inflation Manager, clean it up. The details on this is very simple. In each call that you do, you use CRS binding.inflation manager. We have a register function that takes two parameters. The key, which is the name you want to give this registry that you've created for this template that you've passed on, which is this template element, so by the way. Then when you want to generate the UI for it, you use the get method, and you pass on the key that you've registered the template with, and the array of objects that define the data structure. And then once we are done, you unregister the template using the key that you have defined. I did a bit of a cleanup on the code just to show the life cycle of the stuff, and that it doesn't have to happen in that sequence on the event, because we want to be able to reuse this every time the data changes, and I don't want to re-register and clean everything up every time the data changes. All I want to do on the data changes is go and get myself a new set of static HTML and then update the UI accordingly. So here I've added step 1 to the connected callback, where I go and get the template and I register it with the Inflation Manager. And on the disconnected callback, we are definitely done with it, so we go and unregister that with that. However, on the render, we're just saying regenerate the HTML for me, update the UI. And this can happen as many times as what the data changes until you are done. Looking at our page, we can see there's our button that we have. When we click our button, now we can see there is the LIs that was generated for us during the inflation process, each one with static information. Now please note that if you change these values in the data array, it will not automatically reflect here because it is static in nature. The whole point of the inflation manager is that you are working with static information. There are other ways on how I can dynamically update collections on the binding engine, but that's a subject for another video. Taking a closer look at our template that we're using, you'll notice that the expressions is standard one-way binding expressions. But we can do a little bit more than just show static information. We can also have conditional rendering happening even though it's inflation and static in nature. Let's have a look at that next. I have added a style color bind on it like I would have done normally, and the condition that I've put on here to say if the age is less than 50, I want the color to be blue, else if it's 50 or above, I want it to be red. Going to our view, when we click on the render button, we can now see that John Doe is 20 and it's blue. Jane Smith is 22 and is blue, but Roger Rabbit is 50 and that is now red. So let's go and have a look at what we've actually generated here. Looking at this expression, we can see it's just the stock standard style that we've set. Very simple, nothing to it. What if I actually wanted the whole LI to be that color, not just the age? Easy. I can just cut that from here, go stick it on my LI, and when we go back to the DOM, refresh and render, we can now see that the entire LI is now styled and not just the age span. It does exactly the same thing, just moves the logic to a different element. So on the inflation manager, you can do quite a number of things. One of which is also around translations, but I think that we will deal with that when we have a look at the translations part. The last part of this before we finish is just to chat about the binding context. So up to this point of time, the binding context is the view model or the bindable element that you've been binding against, but that doesn't really count for this because there is no first name or last name or age on the view model, and you don't pass on the view model to the binding engine in any way. You pass on the data. So let's just go and have a look at what this data looks like compared to the HTML. So we'll take the HTML, move our data alongside. The important part to note here is that we're going to be looping through the data, and as we are looping through the data, we're going to be generating this HTML for each data item. And at that particular point of time, the data item that you're busy with is the binding context. So this binding expression is a one-to-one match to the properties that you have on your data. So to summarize, the data item is the context and you bind directly to the data item structure, not according to the view model or the bindable element.